This is week 4, video 2 on ethnicity. So ethnicity is one of the ways that we see social structure leading to different access to resources at the state level. And ethnicity, as you can imagine, is something that anthropologists have paid a lot of attention to. So let's go back to the definition of race we've been using in this course. We defined race as a powerful social and cultural category that differentiates groups of people based on perceived physical characteristics and their presumed relationships to behavioral characteristics. Well, really, ethnicity works the same way. So ethnicity is also a powerful social and cultural category that differentiates groups of people based on perceived rather than physical, linguistic, cultural, religious, or other characteristics, including physical, and their presumed relationships to behavioral characteristics. So we start to say, Moroccans are this way because of this. Americans are this way because of this. This racial or ethnic group is this way because of this. Now, one interesting distinction between these definitions of race and ethnicity is that the way we're talking about race is in terms of an external imposition of this category on a group of people. But in ethnicity, we can see that it could be an external imposition or an internal imposition. And often ethnic groups will draw these boundaries around themselves and differentiate themselves according to these characteristics and their presumed relationships to behavioral characteristics. So dimensions of ethnicity include many different things, not just these, but we can talk about language, religion, history, geography, kinship, even race. I believe really race is more of a category of ethnicity than it is, obviously, a biological term, and even class. So let's look at some examples. First of all, let's go to Morocco in Northwest Africa, which, as you know, is where I spent a lot of time doing research. And in Morocco, there are a couple of different groups of people who have been intermarried for hundreds of years and are actually quite hard to distinguish in many ways. They are the Berbers, B-E-R-B-E-R-S, the so-called indigenous peoples of North Africa, and the Arabs, A-R-A-B-S, who came to Morocco hundreds of years ago, and again, mostly intermarried with the Berbers. Now, when I was in Morocco, it was very hard. You'd hear terms like Arabs and Berbers. It was very hard to make out the difference. Sometimes it seemed to have to do with language. Sometimes it seemed to have to do with a particular location where one was born. It was sometimes about skin color, and it seemed to be very complicated, and people used those terms in different ways to describe themselves or others. Now, Berber came to have a particular political meaning under French colonialism. So while the French were in what they called a protectorate relationship with Morocco, they looked out in the population and they said, okay, Berbers seem a little different from the people who strictly consider themselves Arab. They're a little bit lighter skinned. Sometimes they have blue or green eyes, so they kind of look more like the French. They have a different language that's maybe a little bit more pleasing to the ears than Arabic. They don't seem to practice Islam quite as ardently. The rural practice of Islam is a lot more flexible than the way it's practiced in the cities. And they thought, this might be a good way to kind of divide and conquer. So we can sort of pick out the Berbers and give them preferential treatment. We can make it easy for them to go to France and get an education. We can establish certain schools for them and educate them differently and really educate them in French and so forth and so on. And so they tried to sort of divide the population in that way. But it didn't really work. The Berbers, by and large, said, Berber, Arab, we're all Moroccan. We don't want to be colonized, so we're not going to fall for this. Now, after the end of French colonialism in 1956, Morocco, like many other post-colonial nations, went through a nationalist period. And in the nationalist period, the newly formed Moroccan government said, who are we going to be? What is our primary identity going to be? And they decided their primary identity would be Arab and Muslim and Arabic speaking, although they kept some French, of course, because many of them were educated in French. But anyway, you can tell from that Arab, Muslim, Arabic speaking, that they intended to sort of subsume the Berber identity into this new Moroccan identity. And that's just what they did through some pretty punishing laws. So, for example, you were not allowed to name your child a Berber name. You had to give your child an Arab name. There were no schools where Berber was taught or encouraged or even allowed. So if you were Berber and you wanted your kid to go to school, your kid was going to learn in Arabic. And there were other things like that. There were no newspapers or television shows in Berber. The official languages of Morocco were Arabic and French. And there was just this general nationalist effort to kind of erase the Berber identity. Now, as you can imagine, that was egregious to the Berbers, so it inspired a political movement. And then Berber became a very powerful political term. And, there were people for decades sometimes even giving their lives in support of a Berber movement. By the way, Berber is the Western name for this group of people. Their name for themselves is the Imazigan. And just so you'll know, since the enthronement of Morocco's current king in 1999, there's been a kind of Berber revival. So the king reversed previous policies. Now Berber is one of the official languages. Schools are allowed to teach in Berber regions of the country. There are Berber newspapers, Berber television and radio channels. All government documents are produced in Berber, as well as Arabic and French. And now you don't have to choose between being Arab and Moroccan, or Arab and Berber. And there aren't kind of like political and economic ramifications for that choice. So we can see same groups of people, but in different historical periods for different political purposes, the meaning of being Berber or Arab or Moroccan changes. And so that shows that it's a, social, cultural category that's shifting in its meaning. Let's look at another example from Eastern Europe, the Balkan region, and the horrible war and ethnic cleansing that was carried out in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 1990s. So this was a real shock to the world, or at least to Europeans, because it was so brutal, and again, there was ethnic cleansing and genocide, and, Europeans sort of prided themselves on being past all of this. They were very surprised that something like this could happen in Europe, but it did. And it was based on ethnicity. So if you'll look at this map, notice 3 identity groups. First of all, in yellow are the ethnic Croats. In pink, there are the ethnic Serbs. And then look in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there are yellow areas and pink areas, and then there are green areas. And the green areas are where the majority of the population are Muslim. So these are 3 very interesting groups of people because they're, we could say in primordial terms, in blood terms, they're exactly the same. They're all South Slavs. They all speak basically the same language and always have. They came into the area at the same time together and then kind of spread out. But the groups in the north were close to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so at some point they sort of gravitated toward Catholicism. The pink people, the Serbs, became part of their own Orthodox Christian church, and Orthodox and Catholic Christianity are quite different and have different histories. And so there was the Serbian Orthodox Church. So most Serbs became Orthodox. And then, for a long period of time later, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, which was Muslim, dominated part of this territory. And so many people who might have been Catholic or Orthodox before they converted to Islam. Uh, Sometimes perhaps genuinely, sometimes perhaps, in order to get access to power or whatever the reason is, they became Muslim. So we can say, for the most part, this is glossing over a lot of historical change, but for the most part, these people got along pretty well for most of their history, until the 20th century. And when they were under the kind of autocratic rule of Tito, they were kind of forced to have a shared nationalism. They became Yugoslavia, and so the Yugoslav identity sort of erased any other identity. But after the end of Tito's rule, things kind of fell apart. And so then the Croats started thinking, well, gosh, we really want our own nation called Croatia, and there are all these Serbs living there, so let's force them out. And so they carried out some ethnic cleansing. And then the Serbs said, well, we want our own nation. We'll call it Serbia. And, we want it to include parts of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina that used to be part of Serbia. We want to have greater Serbia. So they started ethnic cleansing against Croats and then against Bosnian Muslims. And so then the fight came to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And first, the Muslims and the Croat Catholics were working together against the Serbs, but then that broke down, and the Croats and Bosnian Muslims started to go at each other as well. And there's a wonderful film that I show in a class I teach on violence and conflict about a village just north of Sarajevo, the capital city of Bosnia and Herzegovina, during this war. And it's a village that comprises Muslims and Catholics. And at the beginning of the film, they're all talking about what good friends they are, how much they love each other, how the conflict will not end their friendships. They're intermarried. They celebrate holidays together. They're the best of friends. They've lived together peacefully for centuries. And then you start to see a little bit of a change. So there's a news broadcast that says in another Muslim village, some Catholics have killed Muslims. And so then you see the Muslims in this village asking themselves, gosh, could that happen here? Surely not, but what if? And so they start to be a little suspicious of their Catholic neighbors. And then you hear a Catholic family in that village, their cousin was killed in fighting in another village. He was killed by Muslims. So then the Catholics start saying, are the Muslims really our enemy? And you just see the social relations break down. And suddenly being Catholic or being Muslim, which has never really mattered before, means everything. It means life or death. And the amazing thing about this film is that from the beginning of the film to the end of the film is only 6 weeks. So in 6 weeks, all of that peaceful living together can be erased by ethnicity. And the third example comes from Japan. It's a class-based ethnicity involving a group of people called the Burakumin, who over 150 years ago were considered polluted because they did the dirty work. They cleaned up animal waste, they cleaned up the streets. They came to be seen as polluted. So they had their own neighborhoods. Other Japanese didn't really want to intermarry with them. They had their separate educational system and everything. They were kind of cut off from the rest of society. That was 150 years ago. That caste system has been outlawed since then. And yet today, the Burakumin still face some of the same kinds of discrimination. They're still a little bit shunned, a little bit outcast. They have their own neighborhoods. There are sort of affirmative action programs to help get them places in economic institutions, and so forth and so on. So that has lasted as a class-based ethnicity, even though in every other way they are, quote-unquote, Japanese. So dimensions of ethnicity, we really have to ask ourselves the question, is ethnicity really about power and access to resources, rather than any of these things, language and so forth?